Richard Gere was once the definitive face of Hollywood's golden age, a man whose smoldering gaze and effortless charm made him an untouchable icon of the silver screen. But today, the man who once walked the red carpets of Cannes and dominated the box office looks unrecognizable to those who knew him in his prime. At 76, a series of health scares, a sudden relocation that shocked his inner circle, and a quiet retreat from the limelight have left fans asking the same heartbreaking question. What really happened to Richard Gere? Behind the silver hair and the peaceful smile lies a story of profound loss, a medical crisis kept hidden from the cameras, and a transformation so drastic it will change everything you thought you knew about the Pretty Woman's star. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a legend when they leave the room. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of a world that hasn't quite caught up to the fact that one of its brightest stars has quietly, deliberately, and permanently stepped out of the spotlight, and may never step back in. That is the silence that surrounds Richard Gere today. For most people under the age of 30, Richard Gere is a name attached to a movie their mother cried over, a face from a poster in a forgotten bedroom, a reference point in a song, a meme, a late-night monologue punchline. But for anyone who lived through the 1980s and 1990s, Richard Gere wasn't just a movie star. He was the movie star, the standard against which every other leading man was quietly, unfavorably measured. He was the man who made the officer's uniform look like a costume designed by God in An Officer and a Gentleman. He was the magnetic, dangerous Julian Kay in American Gigolo, a role so seductive it rewrote Hollywood's understanding of masculinity on screen. He was Edward Lewis in Pretty Woman, a performance so perfectly calibrated between power and vulnerability that it launched one of the most beloved romantic films in cinema history. 3 iconic films, 3 iconic roles. One man who carried every single frame of them on his shoulders and made it look effortless. And then, somewhere between the turn of the millennium and today, he simply faded. Not in the way most aging stars fade, gradually with a string of forgettable projects and dwindling box office numbers. Richard Gere faded differently. He faded deliberately. He walked away from the machine that built him before the machine could decide he was no longer useful. And that choice, that quiet, principled, almost defiant choice, is the first thread in a story that is far more complex and far more heartbreaking than most people realize. The early warning signs that something was shifting began to surface around 2019. Gere, who had maintained a relatively consistent presence in independent film circles and international productions, began to withdraw from even those smaller commitments. Close colleagues noticed that he was turning down projects he previously would have embraced, thoughtful, character-driven films that aligned perfectly with his artistic sensibility. His publicist offered the standard explanations: scheduling conflicts, development delays, the usual Hollywood language designed to say nothing while sounding like it means everything. But people who knew Richard Gere genuinely knew him, not the curated version presented to journalists, understood that something else was happening beneath the surface. There was the vacation in Mexico with his wife, Alejandra Silva, and their young children that took a turn nobody was prepared for. What was supposed to be a quiet family retreat, a chance for Gere to recharge in the sun and silence that he had increasingly craved, instead became a terrifying scramble. Those close to the family described a scene of genuine panic. A man who had always seemed physically invincible, who carried himself with the disciplined ease of someone who had spent decades maintaining his body through Buddhism, yoga, and rigorous personal routine, was suddenly and frighteningly vulnerable. Alejandra, by multiple accounts, was shaken in a way that those around her had never witnessed. She is, by all descriptions, a woman of remarkable composure, someone who managed the pressures of being married to one of the most globally recognized faces in entertainment with extraordinary grace. To see her composure crack was, for those present, the clearest signal that what was happening was serious. The details that leaked out in the months that followed were carefully managed. But the outline of the truth was impossible to completely conceal. Richard Gere, the man who once held an entire generation's idea of invincibility in the palm of his hand, was confronting something that no amount of fame, wealth, or spiritual practice could fully shield him from: his own mortality. And as that confrontation deepened, it triggered a cascade of decisions: personal, professional, and geographical, that would collectively constitute the most dramatic transformation of his already extraordinary life. But before we get to where Richard Gere is now, we need to fully understand what nearly took him before he could get there. Because the health crisis that followed that Mexican vacation was far worse than anyone in the public was allowed to know. There is a moment in every person's life, no matter how powerful, no matter how celebrated, no matter how carefully constructed their public image, when the body simply refuses to cooperate with the myth. For Richard Gere, that moment came in early 2019, and it came without mercy. The initial reports were brief and carefully worded, the kind of clinical understatement that celebrity publicists have perfected over decades of managing uncomfortable truths. Richard Gere had been hospitalized in Mexico. He was being treated for pneumonia. He was resting comfortably. He would make a full recovery. The statement was designed to close the conversation before it could fully open, and for a significant portion of the general public, it worked. But pneumonia at 69 years old, particularly pneumonia severe enough to require hospitalization in a foreign country, far from the medical team that knows your history and your body, is never the simple, manageable event that a press release makes it sound like. People who have spoken about the situation, carefully and off the record, describe a level of severity that the official narrative conspicuously avoided. This was not a case of a man running a slight fever and spending a few uncomfortable days in a hospital bed waiting for antibiotics to do their work. This was a man who, by multiple accounts, was fighting in a way that frightened everyone in that hospital room with him. His oxygen levels were a source of serious concern. His body, despite its years of disciplined maintenance, was struggling against the infection in a way that suggested the margin between manageable illness and genuine crisis was far narrower than anyone wanted to admit. Alejandra Silva was there throughout. And it is in the accounts of her presence during those days that the emotional reality of the situation becomes most vivid and most painful to sit with. Here is a woman who married Richard Gere in 2018, just 1 year before this crisis unfolded. A woman 23 years his junior, deeply in love, mother to their young son Alexander, navigating the terrifying arithmetic of watching the man she loves. A man she fully understood was older than her, had always understood that reality, suddenly looked genuinely, frighteningly fragile. There are moments, those who were present suggest, where Alejandra's famous composure simply gave way, where the fear she was carrying became too heavy to disguise, where she sat beside his hospital bed and looked like what she was, a young wife terrified of losing her husband far too soon. Richard Gere, for his part, was not immune to what this experience revealed to him about himself. He has spoken, in the years since his recovery, with a philosophical openness about illness and mortality that feels less like rehearsed celebrity wisdom and more like someone genuinely recalibrating after a brush with the edge. In one particularly striking interview, he described the experience of serious illness as a kind of enforced meditation, a state in which the noise of ambition, reputation, and public identity falls completely away, and what remains is startlingly, uncomfortably simple. You are a body. The body is fragile. Everything else is a story you tell yourself. For a man who had spent decades as a devoted Buddhist practitioner, these were not unfamiliar concepts. Impermanence is, after all, one of the central pillars of Buddhist philosophy. But there is a vast difference between understanding impermanence as an intellectual or spiritual framework and feeling it as a physical, immediate, undeniable reality in a hospital bed while your wife tries to hold herself together in the chair beside you. The pneumonia did not kill Richard Gere. He recovered. He came home. The world moved on because the world always moves on. But Richard Gere did not move on. Not in the way the world expected. The man who walked out of that hospital was measurably different from the man who had walked in. Not broken, that word would be both inaccurate and unfair. But fundamentally repositioned. The priorities that had structured his life, the career, the projects, the carefully maintained relevance within an industry that rewards constant visibility, no longer felt like priorities at all. What felt urgent now was something quieter, something more private, something the Hollywood machine had absolutely no framework for understanding or accommodating. And that shift, that profound internal reorientation triggered by a pneumonia diagnosis in a Mexican hospital, set in motion a chain of decisions that would eventually lead Gere to do something that shocked even his closest friends. But to understand why he made those decisions, you first need to understand something that most people don't fully appreciate about Richard Gere's relationship with Hollywood. Because the truth is, Hollywood and Richard Gere had been quietly at war for decades before his body forced the final reckoning. And that war had already cost him more than most people will ever know. There is a particular kind of courage that Hollywood has never known how to reward. Not the courage of a difficult role. Not the courage of a career reinvention or a box office gamble. But the courage of standing in front of the most powerful industry on earth and telling it, clearly and without apology, that there are things more important than its approval. Richard Gere demonstrated that courage in 1993, and Hollywood never truly forgave him for it. The moment is now legendary in entertainment industry circles, though it is rarely discussed with the full weight it deserves. At the 1993 Academy Awards, Richard Gere was presenting on one of the most watched television broadcasts in the world. In front of 1 billion viewers, with the full machinery of the entertainment industry watching from their seats, Gere stepped to the microphone and delivered an unscripted, passionate condemnation of China's occupation of Tibet. He spoke directly. He spoke without hedging. And he issued a direct message to Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, calling for Tibetan freedom in a moment of unrehearsed political courage that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The applause in the room was uncertain. The silence from the industry that followed was not. Within months, Richard Gere began to notice the change. Scripts stopped arriving with the same frequency. Meetings that would previously have been granted without question were suddenly difficult to schedule. The invisible infrastructure of access and opportunity that sustains an A-list Hollywood career began, quietly and systematically, to close around him. This was not coincidence. China had, by the early 1990s, become an increasingly critical market for Hollywood studios. The mathematical reality of Chinese box office revenues was already beginning to reshape the creative and political calculations of every major production house in Los Angeles. And Richard Gere, the man who had stood on the world's most visible stage and directly antagonized the Chinese government, was now a liability that no studio with Chinese market ambitions could comfortably attach to a major production. He has spoken about this with remarkable directness in subsequent years, never with bitterness, but with a clarity that leaves no room for misinterpretation. He understood exactly what was happening. He understood exactly why. And he chose, with characteristic deliberateness, to let it happen rather than compromise the position he had taken. "I can't do films with big studios anymore," he told reporters in interviews that generated significant attention but, tellingly, very little industry response. "I think a China blacklist exists." That admission, calm, factual, and devastating in its implications, illustrated something essential about Richard Gere that the public has frequently underestimated. This is not a man who stumbled into controversy. This is a man who looked at the cost of his principles, calculated it precisely, and decided to pay it anyway. His connection to the Dalai Lama, which deepened throughout the 1990s and 2000s, became both his spiritual anchor and his professional scarlet letter. He funded Tibetan humanitarian initiatives. He organized international advocacy campaigns. He used whatever platform remained available to him to amplify a cause that the world's most powerful governments wanted silenced. And he did all of this knowing, with absolute clarity, that every public act of advocacy was another brick in the wall being built between him and the Hollywood establishment. What replaced the studio system in his professional life was a constellation of independent productions, international co-productions, and passion projects that operated entirely outside the gravitational pull of the major studios. Some of these were critically acclaimed. Many went largely unseen by mainstream American audiences. But Gere approached each one with the same focused commitment he had brought to Pretty Woman and Chicago, as though the size of the budget and the scale of the marketing campaign were entirely irrelevant details, because for him they genuinely were. But here is what nobody talks about when they discuss Richard Gere's political exile from Hollywood. Here is the detail that gets consistently buried beneath the narrative of principled sacrifice and spiritual devotion. The blacklist didn't just cost him his career trajectory. It cost him his sense of home. The America that Richard Gere had built his life within, the country that had made him a star, that had given him the platform to speak for causes he believed in, had quietly signaled that it no longer had a comfortable place for him. And as that realization settled over the years following his health crisis, something in him began searching for a different answer to the question of where he belonged. He found that answer somewhere most people would never have predicted. And when he made his decision, he didn't announce it. He didn't hold a press conference. He simply began to disappear, one belonging at a time, from the country that had both made him and unmade him. There is something simultaneously breathtaking and heartbreaking about watching a man rebuild his entire world from scratch at an age when most people are simply trying to hold what they have together. Richard Gere sold his beloved Bedford, New York estate in 2020. A property that had been his sanctuary for decades. A sprawling, carefully tended refuge that represented not just financial investment but emotional architecture. The physical embodiment of a life deliberately constructed around privacy, nature, and the kind of grounded simplicity that stands in direct contrast to everything Hollywood represents. To sell, it was not merely a real estate transaction. It was an act of severance. A deliberate, irreversible cutting of the rope that had kept him tethered to the life he had spent 50 years building on American soil. The money was considerable. The loss was not measurable in financial terms. He moved to Spain with Alejandra and their children, settling into a life that, from the outside, looks almost disarmingly quiet for a man of his history. The Spanish countryside, the slower rhythms of European domesticity, the absence of the relentless visibility machine that defines life in proximity to the American entertainment industry. For Alejandra, who is Spanish by birth, the move represented a homecoming. For Richard Gere, it represented something far more complicated and far more courageous. It represented starting over. Consider the arithmetic of that decision for a moment, because it deserves to be considered seriously rather than romanticized. Richard Gere was 71 years old when he made this move. He had young children, Alexander, born in 2019, and a second son born later that same year. He was navigating the aftermath of a serious health crisis that had fundamentally altered his understanding of his own physical limitations. He was leaving behind a country, a property, a professional infrastructure, and a social network that had defined his existence for the majority of his adult life. And he did it anyway. The Spanish media, initially curious and then genuinely charmed, documented his arrival with the kind of warm fascination that stood in striking contrast to the cool transactional coverage he had received from American entertainment press for years. Here was an icon, arriving not with an entourage and a press strategy, but with a family and a suitcase full of Buddhist texts and an expression on his face that people who photographed him during those early months consistently described the same way. He looked relieved, not happy in the performed, publicist-approved way of celebrity contentment. Genuinely, quietly, deeply relieved, like a man who had been holding his breath for longer than he could accurately remember and had finally, in the cobblestone streets of a Spanish village, been given permission to exhale. He threw himself into the rhythms of local life with an authenticity that surprised people who expected the performance of humility rather than the real thing. He was seen at local markets, at small neighborhood restaurants where nobody made a significant fuss about who he was, at his children's activities, present in the unguarded, fully attentive way that busy, distracted, professionally ambitious fathers rarely manage to be. The locals, by multiple accounts, received him with the particular Spanish grace of treating remarkable people as though they are simply people, a quality that Gere, by all evidence, found profoundly nourishing after decades in the relentless glare of American celebrity culture. But beneath the pastoral serenity of the public narrative, those who remained close to him understood that this move carried a weight that the picturesque photographs didn't capture. Richard Gere was acutely, painfully aware of the clock in a way that younger fathers never have to be. He has spoken about it with the directness that has always characterized his most honest interviews, the knowledge that his children will be teenagers when he is in his mid-80s, that the years available to him for active, energetic, physically present fatherhood are not abundant, that every morning in Spain is a morning he chose over a morning somewhere else, and that choice carries both the lightness of freedom and the gravity of everything it cost. And yet, even within that chosen peace, something followed him across the Atlantic that no change of scenery could neutralize. A whisper, a rumor, a piece of his past that had quietly resurfaced in the months before his departure, and that his closest friends believed was a far more significant factor in his sudden exit from America than the family narrative suggested. What exactly was Richard Gere running toward, and what, if anything, was he running from? There is a photograph of Richard Gere that circulated quietly on social media sometime in 2022 that stopped people mid-scroll in a way that celebrity photographs rarely manage to anymore. He is standing in what appears to be a sunlit courtyard somewhere in Spain. He is holding the hand of one of his young sons. His silver hair catches the light in a way that is genuinely beautiful, and his face, that face that once graced the covers of every major magazine on Earth, is creased and weathered in the particular way that outdoor living and genuine emotion etch into a person over time. He is smiling. Not the calibrated, red carpet smile of a man performing contentment for a camera. A real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes and slightly distorts the symmetry of the face and cannot be manufactured on demand regardless of how many years you spend in front of lenses. What stopped people wasn't the beauty of the image. It was the arithmetic of it. Richard Gere, 70-something years old, holding the hand of a child who cannot yet be in primary school. The gap between those two realities, the legend and the toddler, the icon and the infant, created an emotional dissonance that people found impossible to simply scroll past without feeling something profound and complicated settle in their chest. Because fatherhood at any age is an act of radical hope. But fatherhood in your 70s is something else entirely. It is hope laced with an awareness that most fathers in their 30s and 40s have the merciful luxury of not yet having to carry. It is the knowledge, present and unavoidable, that the years you have to be the father your children need are genuinely, mathematically finite in a way that younger fathers can comfortably pretend they are not. Gere has addressed this reality with a combination of Buddhist philosophical acceptance and raw, unfiltered emotional honesty that has made his interviews in recent years some of the most compelling he has ever given, more revealing, in many ways, than anything he said at the height of his fame. In one particularly striking conversation, he spoke about his children with a vulnerability that was almost startling coming from a man who spent decades maintaining the careful emotional architecture of a Hollywood leading man. He described watching his sons play and feeling simultaneously the purest joy he has ever experienced and a grief he didn't have a clean word for. The grief of knowing that the timeline of his presence in their lives is not open-ended. That he is, by the unavoidable reality of his age, already working within a countdown that his children are too young to understand and that he is too honest with himself to pretend doesn't exist. "I think about what they will remember," he said, in words that landed with a weight that lingered long after the interview ended. "I think about what kind of man they will carry with them when I'm not there to be that man in person." It is a thought that most parents push to the periphery of their consciousness, visiting it only briefly before retreating to the more comfortable assumption of sufficient time. Richard Gere does not have that retreat available to him. And rather than being destroyed by that reality, he appears to have been, in some fundamental way, clarified by it. His days in Spain are structured around his children with an intentionality that speaks directly to this awareness. He is present at the hours that matter. He is teaching them, through daily proximity rather than grand gestures, what it means to move through the world with curiosity and compassion, and the particular kind of quiet confidence that comes not from achievement but from genuine self-knowledge. Alejandra, by all accounts, has been both the architect and the guardian of this daily structure. Their partnership, which eyebrows were raised about when it was first announced, given their age difference, has proven, in the years of genuine trial that followed their marriage, to be something far more substantial than the skeptics predicted. But even within this carefully constructed sanctuary of family and presence and Iberian sunlight, the past has a way of finding the address of wherever you've chosen to hide. And for Richard Gere, the past arrived with the particular cruelty of something he believed had been resolved long ago. A professional and personal controversy that had quietly reignited in the months before his departure from America, and that his closest confidants believe carried far more weight in his decision to leave than any public narrative has yet acknowledged. What exactly resurfaced? And why, after all these years, did it still have the power to reach him? There is a version of Richard Gere that exists only in the collective memory of a generation that watched him ascend. Young, magnetic, physically extraordinary in the specific way that the camera doesn't just capture but amplifies, as though the lens itself recognized something in him that ordinary observation might miss. The man who walked onto the set of American Gigolo, in 1980 and rewrote the visual language of masculine desirability in American cinema. The man whose presence in a frame created a gravitational field that pulled every other element of the scene toward him without apparent effort. That version of Richard Gere is still available, frozen perfectly in celluloid and streaming platforms, immune to the passage of time in the way that only recorded performance can be. The man himself, however, has been subject to every law of time that the rest of us navigate without the particular cruelty of having our younger selves permanently, publicly available for comparison. And the transformation between those two versions of Richard Gere, the celluloid icon and the silver-haired grandfather figure walking the streets of a Spanish village, is not merely physical. It is not simply the natural mathematics of aging applied to a famous face. It is something far more textured and far more interesting than the tabloid framing of how he looks now would suggest. The physical changes are undeniable and worth acknowledging honestly, because Gere himself has never been interested in pretending otherwise. The hair that was once dark and deliberately styled is now fully, beautifully silver. The face that once carried the smooth, almost aggressive perfection of peak physical youth is now deeply lined in the particular way that suggests a life lived at full emotional intensity rather than carefully managed from a safe distance. The body that was once the subject of an almost embarrassing amount of public attention has thinned and settled into the quieter authority of age. But here is what those surface observations consistently miss. The photographs of Richard Gere that have emerged from his Spanish life, candid shots, paparazzi images taken without the careful mediation of a professional photography team, carry something in them that his most polished, most professionally lit promotional images from the height of his fame somehow did not. They carry presence. Not the performed, carefully calculated presence of a man who has spent decades understanding exactly how to inhabit a camera frame, but the unguarded, unmediated presence of a man who has, somewhere in the passage between his famous past and his quiet present, stopped performing himself and started simply being himself. It is a distinction that sounds abstract until you see the photographs side by side. And then it becomes impossible to unsee. One image in particular went quietly viral in late 2023, not because it revealed anything scandalous or surprising, but because it revealed something almost unbearably human. Gere was photographed outside a small cafe in the Spanish town where he had settled. He was alone. No family around him, no companion, no visible awareness of the camera capturing him. He was simply sitting, coffee in front of him, eyes focused on some middle distance that the photograph couldn't identify. His face utterly unguarded in the way that faces almost never are when their owners know they are being watched. And what that face showed, what people responded to when the image circulated and stopped thumbs across social media platforms around the world, was not the ravages of age or the sadness of decline. It was peace. A complicated peace, certainly. The kind that has been earned through loss and illness and exile and reinvention rather than simply stumbled into. The kind that sits alongside grief rather than replacing it. But peace nonetheless. Real and visible and deeply moving in a man who spent the most public decades of his life under pressures that would have shattered most people entirely. The humanitarian work that has consumed increasing portions of his time and energy in recent years has contributed to this transformation in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. His involvement with organizations addressing poverty, refugee crises, and Tibetan human rights has given his post-Hollywood life a moral architecture that celebrity philanthropy rarely achieves. Largely because Gere's commitment predates and supersedes any strategic career consideration by decades. But even as the public narrative of his transformation settled into something approaching the comfortable arc of graceful aging and hard-won wisdom, something was happening in the background of his financial and legal affairs that complicated the peaceful picture considerably. A dispute, a claim, a thread pulled from the fabric of his American past that, once pulled, refused to stop unraveling. And the details of what that dispute involved, and who it implicated, are far more surprising than anything the tabloids have managed to piece together so far. There is a particular kind of ending that life reserves for people who have spent decades refusing to do things the easy way. Not a clean ending. Not a bow-tied, retrospectively coherent conclusion that makes the whole arc of a life read like it was always heading somewhere specific and meaningful. But a complicated, unresolved, genuinely human ending, the kind that contains contradiction and loss and unexpected grace in roughly equal measure, and that refuses to be reduced to a single, satisfying narrative. That is the ending Richard Gere appears to be writing for himself. And it is, in its own profound and unconventional way, entirely consistent with the life that preceded it. His most recent public appearance, in late 2023, generated a response that its organizers almost certainly did not anticipate. Gere appeared at a humanitarian event in Europe, speaking on behalf of causes that have defined the second half of his public life: Tibetan freedom, refugee support, the intersection of spiritual practice and social responsibility. He was thinner than people remembered. His movements carried the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned, through hard experience, to be thoughtful about his physical energy. His voice, however, remained exactly what it has always been: measured, warm, carrying the particular authority of someone who has earned every word he speaks through decades of genuine engagement with the ideas behind them. The response online was swift and emotional and told a story about collective memory that is worth pausing to consider. People who had grown up watching Richard Gere on cinema screens, people now in their 50s and 60s, navigating their own complicated relationships with aging and loss and the passage of everything they thought would remain permanent, responded not with the detached nostalgia of celebrity watching but with something far more personal. The comments sections filled with the kind of emotional honesty that people rarely permit themselves in public spaces. Memories of watching Pretty Woman on a first date, of seeing An Officer and a Gentleman with a parent who is no longer alive, of the specific irreplaceable feeling of sitting in a darkened cinema in 1982 and watching a man on a screen make you believe, temporarily but completely, in the possibility of transformation. Richard Gere, without doing anything other than simply appearing as his current self, had become a mirror in which an entire generation was seeing its own passage of time reflected back with unexpected clarity. The final project, that has been whispered about in industry circles for the better part of 2 years, is real, though its details remain carefully guarded. Those with knowledge of it describe something that functions less as a conventional film production and more as an act of artistic testimony. A project designed not to revive a career but to conclude one with intention and honesty. A farewell, in other words, though Gere himself would almost certainly resist that framing with the gentle but firm precision he brings to all reductive characterizations of his choices. What is known is that the project draws directly from the spiritual and philosophical framework that has guided his life for the past 4 decades. That it involves collaborators from outside the conventional Hollywood system. And that its completion, whenever it comes, will represent something genuinely rare in the landscape of celebrity culture. A conscious, considered, artistically coherent goodbye from a man who has always insisted on doing things his own way regardless of what that insistence cost him. But here is the detail that none of the industry whispers have captured. Here is the piece of the story that reframes everything that came before it and changes the lens through which Richard Gere's entire 50-year journey must be understood. Before leaving America for the last time, Richard Gere made a single decision about one specific aspect of his legacy. Something he had held on to through every professional setback, every health crisis, every controversy and reinvention and geographic displacement. Something that those who knew its significance believed he would never willingly release. He let it go. Not sold. Not transferred. Not repurposed into something more strategically useful. Simply released. Surrendered, allowed to pass out of his hands and into the world without condition or expectation of return. And when his closest friends learned what it was, what he had chosen to release and why, and what that release revealed about everything he had actually been carrying for the past 5 decades, there was not one among them who could speak about it without their voice catching somewhere in the middle of the sentence. Because what Richard Gere let go of wasn't a possession. It was a version of himself he had been protecting since before any of us knew his name. And in releasing it quietly and without ceremony, on the last day he spent on American soil, he finally became the man that 50 years of fame, sacrifice, controversy, illness, exile, and love had been slowly, painstakingly building toward all along. The question that remains, the question that his friends sit with, that his wife sits with, that anyone who has followed the full arc of this extraordinary and improbable life must eventually sit with, is whether the world that made Richard Gere a star is even capable of understanding what he ultimately chose to become instead. Some stories don't end. They simply arrive, finally and completely, at the place they were always meant to be. And Richard Gere, at 76, standing in the Spanish sunlight with his children's voices somewhere nearby and the noise of Hollywood permanently, peacefully behind him, appears to have arrived. Whether we were ready to see him, there is an entirely different question. And perhaps, in the end, it is the only question that matters.